This is part 2 of chapter 15 on intervention modalities of the O'Brien and Hussey text published in 2012. Part 2 of the presentation will continue with preparatory methods, more specifically orthotics, and then move into purposeful activity, which includes simulated or contrived activity, and then conclude with occupation-based activity. What are orthotics? Orthotics are defined by your text as any apparatus used to support, align, prevent, or correct deformities, or to improve the function of a movable part of the body. Orthotics can be prefabricated or custom made. There are 3 primary purposes of an orthotic device. 1. To restrict movement. 2. To immobilize a body part. 3. To mobilize a body part. There are 2 main classifications of orthosis, static and dynamic. Static has no moving components and remains in a fixed position. On the right-hand side of the slide, there is a photo of a resting hand splint, which is made of thermoplastic material. And the splint immobilizes the wrist as well as the digits of the hand, preventing them from going into flexion. Dynamic orthosis has 1 or more flexible components that move. Its purpose is to increase passive motion, enhance active motion, or replace lost motion. Dynamic orthoses have movable components consisting of elastic, rubber bands, or springs, which are attached to a static base. An example of this is the Saboflex, which you can learn more information on by going to part 1 of the presentation, scrolling down to the bottom to the additional resources, and clicking on the appropriate link. So what is purposeful activity? According to your textbook, purposeful activity is goal-directed behaviors or tasks that comprise occupations. Examples of purposeful activity include making a clay pot versus pinching clay. Making a clay pot is purposeful activity. Pinching clay is a preparatory activity. Making a sandwich versus strengthening one's grip using resistive putty such as TheraPutty. Making a sandwich is a purposeful activity, while using resistive putty to strengthen your grip is a preparatory activity. One important aspect of purposeful activity is simulated or contrived activity. The OT uses simulated or contrived activities when the environment, the clinical environment, does not have the required materials and equipment for the activity. Now this does require some aspect of pretending on the part of the client. For example, imitating the movement required to spread peanut butter on a sandwich without having any actual materials, or using a clothing fastener board to simulate dressing tasks such as buttoning or zipping. Here we have 2 different types of manipulation boards. Take a look at the manipulation board on the left. What do you suppose the OT is working on? Take a look at the manipulation board on the right. What do you think that the OT is working on? These 2 boards may be used for simulated or contrived activity during the OT treatment session. Now let's take a look at our good old trusty BTE simulator that we mentioned in part 1 of the presentation. The BTE simulator may also be used in simulated or contrived activity in OT practice. If you take a look at the photo on the left side, you will see that the person is making a pinching motion which resembles pinching clothespins perhaps. If you take a look at the photo on the right side, you will see a photo of a person who appears to be making the motion of swinging a bat. Our next topic is occupation-based activity. As a reminder, the aim of occupational therapy services is to help clients engage in occupations. For example, occupation-based activities for students are reading literature, studying for exams, writing papers. O'Brien and Hussey made it a point to emphasize that the goal of occupational therapy is to help people find those meaningful occupations and return to them. The authors provided the example of people who are in the student role, and they compared one student whose student role is central to their identity versus another student who just goes to school simply because it's required or it's necessary. The overall point here is that each person is a unique individual, and it is the OT's job to identify the occupations that are meaningful to each individual. Here we are revisiting the topic of OT as educators. This is the topic that we discussed earlier in the semester. OT practitioners educate health professionals, clients, family members, staff, employers, and teachers on a variety of topics related to the care and follow-through of a client. OTs may provide knowledge on occupational performance as it relates to a condition, or provide information on occupational resources that are available in the community. Next, let's talk about activity analysis. What is activity analysis? According to your text, activity analysis is the process by which the steps of an activity and its components are examined in detail to determine the demands on the client. O'Brien and Hussey mentioned a few different ways that OTs analyze activities, but I'd like to focus on the OTPF and how the OTPF suggests OTs analyze activity. According to the OTPF, OTs analyze activity by determining the context in which the activity typically occurs and identifying what is needed to perform it, or examining the activity demands, which include physical space, tools, equipment, materials, time, cost required, and social demands. Overall, OT practitioners become skilled at analyzing the detailed steps and actions required to complete daily activities, so they can help clients resume completing activities in their daily lives. Now let's move on to activity synthesis. After the occupational profile is completed, the OT evaluates the client's strengths and weaknesses in order to develop an intervention plan. The intervention plan includes the writing of therapeutic goals and also activities. The OT practitioner completes an activity analysis, which we just spoke about a moment ago, to determine the steps or actions interfering with the client's occupational performance. If you recall, intervention involves therapeutic activity to assist clients in doing the following: mastering a new skill, or restoring a deficit, or compensating for a functional disability, or maintaining health, or preventing dysfunction. Once the gaps in occupational performance are identified by the OT, he or she helps the client to bridge the gaps by providing the just right challenge. And it is the just right challenge that is referred to as activity synthesis. Activity synthesis involves deciding the activities to introduce, the timing of the activities, how to adapt the activities for the client, and the synthesis requires that the OT uses knowledge of the client's condition, the client's individual goals and narrative, and the activity demands. An important component of activity synthesis is grading. Grading involves changing the process, environment, tools, or materials of the activity to increase or decrease the performance demands of the client. Grading is used when the therapeutic goal is to improve or restore function, and when the OT wants to challenge the client to a certain level. One example of this was with your daily occupations assignment. I don't know if you noticed that there was a sheet with a chart in it, and the chart had headings at the top of different areas of occupation: work, play, leisure, etc. And on the left-hand side, there were time slots. And I said to you, as a class, that you did not have to use this worksheet. But the worksheet was attached to the assignment in the event that you had difficulty with completing the activity configuration, the actual diagram, or the picture, the visual that you provided. So what I was doing was actually grading the activity. So if you had difficulty with completing the activity configuration, the diagram, or the circle, the clock-looking figures that we created, you could use the table. And that would have been a little bit easier to keep your data organized. That was actually grading the activity down. Other examples of grading include sanding a piece of wood. If the OT were to increase the requirements, she may change the sandpaper to provide greater resistance, or position the wood that's being sanded and place it on an incline. Another example of grading regarding a shaving activity, or shaving task rather, to decrease the demands, possibly as a result of the client being fatigued, for example, the OT may decrease the requirements of completing the activity, or decrease the activity demands to be exact, by having the client sit while shaving rather than standing, or requiring the client to shave only one side of his face while the OT shaves the other. Another important aspect of activity synthesis is adapting. You will hear this term in OT over and over and over again. Adaptation is the process that changes an aspect of the activity or the environment to enable successful performance and accomplish a therapeutic goal. Adapting of the activity or the environment may allow the client to perform an activity at the highest possible level of function. Adaptation may involve modification of the environment and the use of assistive technologies or alternative strategies. Another important component of activity synthesis is assistive devices. Assistive devices range from low to high technological devices. Low technological devices do not have electronic components. For example, devices for self-feeding, such as those that we saw during the ADL lab. And then high technological devices, which do have electronic components. And these include augmentative communication equipment, electronic aids, and power wheelchairs. And you will become more familiar with these different types of equipment or devices once you're actually in an OT program. The overall point is that the use of devices to aid function is an integral part of the process, and OTs can provide the necessary adaptations so that a client can achieve. Here's a little bit more on adaptation. OTs may need to make modifications to a person's environment to facilitate function. This process begins with the OT evaluating the accessibility of the environment. For example, the home, school, work, and then the OT may make recommendations for modifications. Examples of environmental modifications include the installation of ramps into a building, such as I mentioned in class, oftentimes when a person leaves a hospital or they leave short-term care at a skilled nursing facility and they return home, they may need a ramp so that if they're in a wheelchair, they may need a ramp so that they can access their homes. Another example would be the installation of grab bars for bathroom safety, arrangement of furniture at home or work, or removal of floor rugs for safety. One final point on grading and adaptation. Every OT practitioner must be able to select appropriate activities by 1. Assessing the demands of an activity on many levels. 2. Integrating the information with knowledge of the client's needs and abilities. And 3. Grading and adapting activities as needed. And I would like for you to remember 2 key points from the entire lecture, Part 1 and Part 2. Key point number 1, there is a wide range of therapeutic modalities used in occupational therapy to achieve the goals of the client. Key point number 2, OT practitioners educate clients daily on a host of issues and often provide alternative techniques for performing occupations. This concludes the presentation. Please be sure to go back to Part 1 of the presentation and take a look at the additional resources by clicking on the links which will lead you to either the website that will provide information on the intervention modality, or the link will take you to a video that will provide you with a demonstration of the intervention modality. In addition, please go back and scroll through all of your slides, Part 1 and Part 2, at your own pace as a review.